Some people hate surprises. They want things to fit their expectations, and I can understand that. But every once in a while, it's great to have a wonderful surprise. If you like surprises, pleasant surprises, then I think you'll enjoy the PSB iQ2 streaming-powered speakers. For The Absolute Sound, I'm John Quain.
It was very interesting when I first started listening to 888, by having that extension down to 30 hertz and just hearing everything in the music that you often miss. So I'm very happy with the direction that the 888 went in from that point of view. It does give me more of the music, and I'm enjoying that. And especially being able to play it loud, I'm really enjoying that part. I wish you as much enjoyment listening to my speakers as I had designing them. Thank you.
In case you're not familiar with the company, PSB is from Canada, and they're a company I've followed since their inception almost back to the 70s. They're well known for doing diligent research and analysis of speaker technology, taking advantage of equipment from the National Research Council. I say the National Research Council equipment. What I mean is an anechoic chamber in Ottawa that's the size, well, it's big enough to put a small airplane in. Over the years, PSB has used those facilities and others to examine the technology and refine their technique for building components and also for using anechoic chambers. They may have finally outdone themselves this time with these tiny iQ2 speakers. They stand just 9.7 inches tall, and they're 5.7 inches wide and just a little over 7.5 inches deep. They're bass reflex speakers with a rear port, and they're wireless speakers. They're priced at $13.99 for the pair. They only come in a pair, and they communicate with each other wirelessly, so you're not restricted by having to tether them together with each other. You can plug the PSB iQ2s into a router with Ethernet, or you can do the whole thing wirelessly over Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. They support Bluetooth aptX. Adaptive is the spec. For my auditioning and testing, I plugged them into my Wi-Fi router just to get the best quality I could. They come with their own amplification. They're powered speakers, and they have an onboard high-res DACs that handle up to 24-bit 120K music. So they can handle a score of streaming services as well, including Qobuz, so you don't have to worry about whether it's covered or not. You can also plug in an optical source, analog source, either a turntable or a tape deck or a CD player. They also have, for a television, HDMI eARC, which is the audio return channel. For higher res sound, it'll improve the sound if you've got it in a small space and you're using just the television speakers. This would definitely be a big improvement. And there are inputs also for USB. You can put an external drive on this. All of this is controlled. You can control it by controls on the top of the right-hand speaker. However, the way you really want to use this is using the Blue OS app, which comes free and is available for any smartphone. They're now on version 4.16 of the Blue OS. If you're not familiar with it, NAD, a sister company that's also owned by Lenbrook, also uses this system. It's a multi-room system. It's now more reliable, more mature, and easier to use. So you kind of do everything on that app if you're comfortable doing that. What about the speaker design itself? Well, the PSB iQ2 speakers are two-component designs. They have a 4-inch woofer and a 3/4-inch tweeter, and a flipped design with the woofer on top and the tweeter below. That's intended to make the drivers coincident so that they deliver different frequencies and they all arrive at the same time in the acoustic center, which I found was actually pretty effective. There are different approaches to trying to do that. The PSB iQ2s also employ dual Class D amplifiers in each of the speakers. So each tweeter has a 45 watt amplifier and each woofer has a 90 watt amplifier for a grand total of 270 watts if you're counting. I never felt there was something lacking here, but in case you're wondering about frequency response, they're rated to go from 20K down to 65 hertz. Now, the DSP will also tune these speakers as well, so the perceived levels that you hear at lower frequencies are different from what they might actually rated for. There's a cutoff. You can plug a subwoofer into these as well at about 35 hertz. I didn't find anything was lacking here, but if you're trying to rattle the windows with a recording of the 1812 Overture, yeah, these small speakers, they're not going to do quite that for you, but for most purposes, I think you won't be disappointed. Before we get into specifics, a few overall comments about the sound profile of the PSB iQ2s. They have been, as I said, tuned to deliver a relatively flat lower end, making them fairly linear overall. The DSP really helps do that. It also does some dynamic EQ so that at lower volumes, you don't find sounds disappearing or instruments disappearing. It tends to boost those up a little bit, which is great for date night with jazz or a little bit of Chet Baker. You'll still hear all the music even at those lower volumes. I should point out, however, that you can't really tweak the EQ of these speakers to your personal preferences. There is an EQ setting in the app, but it's just basic bass and treble. So pretty much you have to go with what the engineers intended here. These speakers are really best at producing everything from the wails and crunches of a Fender Strat, but they're also good at conveying the grandeur of a Steinway. They deliver an excellent soundstage for such a diminutive design. That's really part of the surprise here. The instruments are placed in a wider dispersion than I would have expected. Voices appear higher in the soundstage. All this, of course, depends on the mix of the recording that you're listening to. And then the bass notes benefit from being sort of placed lower as well. Again, these speakers have a much bigger presence than their diminutive size would indicate, emphasizing upper and lower frequencies rather than taking an all mid-range approach, which is all too common these days. Okay, so what about some specific examples of the musicality of these speakers, the PSB iQ2s? Well, as a lot of people know, I'd often favor prog rock to test a lot of these, and these speakers are great. At prog rock, they're rendered details very nicely, handled quick time changes, punctilious overdubs, multiple voicings, overproduction. They have great transient response, which all does very well for prog rock, but I won't go into specific examples for that right now. We'll start out with some classical music, Beethoven piano sonatas, 109, 110, and 111. These are done at Suntory Hall in Tokyo. They were recorded last year. Mitsuko Oshida, she does a wonderful dynamic job, a very nuanced performance here. Very live performance, this recording, I have to say. And these speakers do a remarkably able job bringing out that dynamic range and making you feel like you're in Suntory Hall. I didn't lose very much, I thought, here, especially with her work, speaking of Steinways, on a Steinway. For fun, I compared it to another recording, Richard Good's classic recording of Beethoven's complete sonatas. These are certainly technically excellent performance, very adroit, but by comparison, on these speakers especially, it really showed that this recording doesn't have the vitality that Ushida's live recording does. It still sounds great. It's Beethoven's sonatas, what's not to love? But there's definitely a dynamism and a nuance missing in that recording that's brought out on that live recording. So the speakers do a good job of conveying the differences between that. Something else, going to some more rock, I was really thinking of the Cranberries recently. They just re-released an album, 30th anniversary of No Need to Argue album, that album from the Cranberries. And so Dolores O'Riordan's voice is something that's difficult to render in every nuance of her voice. It comes really jumping out of the speakers here, especially on one of the tracks, Ode to My Family. And it just strings her voice out in a thin line in the air, which is really what I think of her voice doing. So also a good job there. And also another artist from going back a few years, but now has a new album out after 16 years of not having anything new to offer us, the Doherty Column, which is really Vinnie Riley on guitar. As I said, first album in 16 years. It's called Renaissance. And it's got a lot of echoing and reverberating guitar work that he's really well known for. That demands an inherent sort of openness to the sound that should be difficult for a tiny pair of speakers to convey. But these speakers managed to do a very good job of it. They often say it's a Canadian sound, this openness, this naturalness, even though Vinnie Riley's from the UK, whatever. These do a very good job of sort of proving that point. There's all this echo on the acoustic guitar, and the echo on tracks on the drums seem to float in the air. Again, great soundstage, very open. Something I wanted to hear a little bit different music, some jazz. I went to Eddie Daniels for some clarinet work on his Heart of Brazil recording. That's from 2018. Look, there are a lot of wonderful clarinetists. To say somebody was a virtuoso in this field, there are a lot of virtuosos, but he's definitely one of the best. So I really wanted to hear whether this tuned his clarinet in upper ranges, which he tends to use a lot, whether it made it sound too harsh. And it didn't. It actually kept the notes pretty well rounded. Now, he doesn't give away a lot. You're not going to hear stuff from his embouchure and things when you listen to these recordings. It sounds pretty perfect. But it did a great job of keeping those notes round and full, and also considering the punchy percussion that's required here. Zottarelli is the percussionist here. It kept that punchy and tight. There's, again, quick transient response, so rim shots don't sort of linger in the air. And the little quarter notes from Daniels, they fill out nicely and seem to pop right out when they should from these speakers. Last but not least, rock and roll, absolutely. I'm sure the convenience of these speakers are intended for a wider audience. And of course, rock is going to be one of the main genres for that wider audience. So I threw some old Led Zeppelin from its first album, the band's first album, at these speakers. Good times, bad times, we're all good times here. The PSB iQ2s bring back the urgency of Jimmy Page's guitar, his blues derived guitar attack here, and there's that wonderful interplay between the overdubbed guitar work and the dialogue between John Paul Jones and John Bonham, like bass and drums. All that's delivered with precision and tightness here, as well as the plaintiveness of Robert Plant's voice. It does make this album seem alive again, even if you haven't heard it or you've heard it many, many times. So what's the bottom line with these speakers? Well, if you're looking at this category of wireless powered speakers that support streaming services and you've got limited space and a modest budget, the PSB iQ2s definitely have to be one of the top models to consider. No question about that. They deliver an open and, yes, natural sound with precise voicing that is comfortable in a variety of genres. For this size and price, I think, as I was, that you'll be pleasantly surprised. If you enjoyed this review and you found it helpful, please subscribe to the Absolute Sound video channel. We also have a newsletter that you're free to subscribe to, and there is the Absolute Sound magazine. Also, consider subscribing to that. For the Absolute Sound, I'm John Quain.